In the iron-cold grip of February 1899, northern Wisconsin was a place of brutal truths. When the mercury in a sealed thermometer retreated to 52 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, it wasn't just a number. It was a verdict. For farmers like Silas Croft, that verdict was death. His new plank-wall chicken coop, built exactly to the specifications of the leading agricultural bulletins, was a tomb. Inside, dozens of carcasses lay frozen solid, the birds' last breaths visible as frost on the rough-hewn wood. Croft was fighting the cold with cordwood and a potbelly stove, and he was losing catastrophically. Miles away, Arthur Brandt's flock was untouched. While Croft's birds froze in their modern house, Brandt's were clucking, scratching, and laying eggs, oblivious to the historic freeze. They were comfortable. They were safe, but they were not in a building. They were 8 feet below the snow, sheltered by 18 inches of sawdust, straw, and the stable, unwavering warmth of the earth itself. Brandt hadn't built a fortress against the cold. He had engineered a geothermal envelope, a series of insulated pits that baffled his neighbors and defied conventional wisdom. What did this quiet, second-generation immigrant understand about thermodynamics that an entire generation of experienced Wisconsin farmers had completely missed? The year 1899 was closing out a century of relentless expansion, but in the cut-over lands of Wisconsin, life was less about conquering a frontier and more about surviving it. Settlers, drawn by the promise of cheap land cleared by the logging barons, found themselves on soil that was thin, acidic, and frozen solid for 5 months of the year. The economy was a fragile ecosystem balanced on small-scale dairy, subsistence crops, and, critically, livestock. For a homestead family, a flock of chickens was not a hobby. It was the difference between solvency and starvation. Eggs were cash. They were protein. A healthy laying flock in January was a financial engine, providing the currency needed for sugar, salt, and kerosene. Protecting that engine was paramount. The established wisdom, filtering down from the agricultural colleges at Madison, was clear. Build a co-op that was clean, bright, and airy. The Wisconsin Standard Co-op, championed in pamphlets and journals, was a 10 by 20-foot shed, raised 24 inches off the ground on posts to deter rats and keep the floor dry. It featured single-plank walls, perhaps a layer of tar paper if the farmer was wealthy, and large, south-facing glass windows to capture the low winter sun. The central tenet was ventilation. Foul air is the enemy, the experts wrote, warning of moisture buildup and respiratory disease. Farmers were instructed to install vents to ensure a constant flow of fresh air. In a mild winter, this design was adequate. In a Wisconsin winter, it was a catastrophic failure. Silas Croft was a man who trusted the experts. He trusted paper plans and milled lumber. His co-op, finished in the fall of 1898, was a point of pride. It cost him $45 for the lumber, glass, and hardware, a significant investment, nearly 2 months of profit from his small dairy operation. It measured 12 feet by 24 feet, large enough for his 100 birds. He built it by the book, raised on sturdy oak posts. When the first deep cold of December arrived, a relatively mild 15 below zero, the problems began. The raised floor, designed to keep the birds dry, allowed the wind to whip underneath, sucking heat from the building at an alarming rate. The waterers, set near the modern glass windows, froze solid within an hour of being filled. To fight this, Silas installed a small cast-iron stove, but the airy design demanded by the bulletins turned the structure into a thermal sieve. He was burning through a quarter cord of valuable oak per week, just to keep the inside of the coop at 10 degrees Fahrenheit. The birds huddled, their combs and wattles turning a pale, waxy purple, the first sign of severe frostbite. Egg production plummeted from 60 eggs a day to 5. Then, in February, the historic Great Blizzard descended. The temperature didn't just drop, it evaporated. For 3 days, the world stopped at 52 degrees below zero. Silas, fighting through drifts, found the stovepipe choked with ice. He couldn't burn a fire without filling the coop with smoke. He had to let it go out. The next morning, he opened the door to a silent, frozen tableau. 84 of his 100 birds were dead. The right way, the scientific modern way, had failed him utterly. Arthur Brandt's knowledge came not from a bulletin, but from observation and memory. He was the son of German immigrants who had scratched a living from the high, rocky pastures of the Alps. He grew up understanding that survival depended not on fighting nature, but on finding accommodations with it. His father had taught him to bank sod against the stone foundation of their home, not just to block wind, but because the earth itself held verma, a steady, constant warmth. When he came to Wisconsin, he spent a winter working a logging camp near the Ojibwe Reservation at Lac du Flambeau. He watched the Ojibwe men. They wore light, layered clothing. Their winter shelters, the wigwam, were not massive, heavy structures. They were small, dugout, and heavily insulated with bark and sod, using the snow itself as a final, perfect blanket. Brandt observed the fox. The fox did not build a fortress. It dug a den, going deep, below the frost line. He learned a fundamental principle that the agricultural bulletins had missed. The air was the enemy, but the earth was an ally. The frost line in northern Wisconsin could reach 40 inches, but below that, the ground held a stable temperature, a constant 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, all winter long. When his neighbors saw him digging a massive pit in the side of a south-facing hill in late summer, they scoffed. "Building a root cellar, Arthur?" Silas Croft had asked, leaning on the fence. "No," Brandt replied quietly, not looking up from his shovel. "A chicken house." The laughter was polite, but clear. "You bury potatoes, Brandt," another neighbor chimed in. "You house chickens. They'll rot in that hole." Brandt's first prototype was an exercise in patient, meticulous engineering, using materials others deemed worthless. He selected a south-facing slope, which would get maximum sun exposure and be protected from the prevailing northwesterly winds. The excavation was the hardest part. He dug an 8-foot-deep pit, 10 feet wide and 15 feet long. This was not a mere hole. It was a precisely measured thermal sink. The labor, done by hand, took him 4 weeks. He spent almost no money. The inner walls of the pit were not the earth itself, which would be damp, but a thin, non-structural lining of salvaged planks from a collapsed barn. The real innovation was the 18-inch gap between this thin plank wall and the earth wall of the excavation. Brandt painstakingly filled this gap with a mixture of sawdust from the local mill, a material they gave away for free, and dry, baled straw from his own fields. He had created an 18-inch thick, continuous insulation envelope. This envelope was the thermal break. It stopped the 45-degree heat of the deep earth from leaking into the frozen soil near the surface. The roof was a low A-frame, its peak only 36 inches above the ground line. It, too, was layered. Salvaged timbers, a layer of tar paper, and then 24 inches of packed sod and earth. Visually, the structure was a failure. It was a mere mound in a hillside, a glorified bunker. To Silas Croft, it looked like a chicken grave. To Arthur Brandt, it was a battery ready to be charged. He was confident, not in his own genius, but in the unyielding laws of physics. The conflict between Arthur Brandt and his neighbors was a philosophical one, a battle of brute force versus intelligent design. The conventional wisdom, embodied by Silas Croft, was rooted in a pioneer mindset. Man must impose his will on the landscape. If it is cold, you must build a bigger fire. If the wind blows, you must build a thicker wall. This philosophy saw the elements as antagonists to be defeated, primarily with labor and fuel. It was a war of attrition. The standard co-op was a fortress, but a poorly designed one. It was tall, creating a large volume of air that was impossible to heat. It was raised, exposing its most vulnerable surface, the floor, to the coldest winds. It demanded constant, expensive inputs: firewood, repairs, and replacement birds. Brandt's philosophy was one of systems. He saw the farm as a closed loop, and the challenge as one of heat management, not heat generation. He was not fighting the cold. He was redirecting energy. His central principle was simple. Why spend precious fuel warming the Wisconsin air when you can capture the free, stable heat of the deep earth? Why build a tall barn that allows the bird's own body heat, a constant 105 degrees Fahrenheit, to rise and dissipate? By building low, he concentrated that biological heat. By building down, he tapped the geothermal furnace. The battle was between mass and insulation, between spending energy and preserving it. The first test came with the December cold snap. Dr. Aris Thorne, a young, pragmatic county extension agent, was making his rounds, charged with recording agricultural data for the university. He was a man of science, carrying a certified thermometer and a leather-bound logbook. He first visited Silas Croft's new modern co-op. The outside temperature was 10 degrees Celsius. Inside, Thorne's thermometer registered 18 degrees Celsius, but only near the stove. In the corners, where the birds were roosting, it was 12 degrees Celsius. He noted the thick frost on the nails inside the walls, a thermal bridge conducting the cold straight through the wood. He counted 12 birds with visible frostbite on their wattles. He logged the fuel consumption, a wheelbarrow of wood every 12 hours. He then traveled to Brant's farm, skeptical about the chicken pit he'd heard about. He descended the 3 earthen steps into the gloom. The air was not foul. It was warm, humid, and smelled of straw and earth. There was no stove. Thorne held his thermometer. He waited. It stabilized at 48 degrees Celsius. The birds were active, scratching in the deep litter, drinking from a waterer that was completely liquid. Thorne was baffled. The heat source wasn't just geothermal. Brant explained his deep litter method. He wasn't cleaning the coop. He was adding a fresh layer of straw every few days. The layers underneath were composting, a slow, biological fire. The floor itself was a furnace, a 2-foot-thick mat of biological activity, generating its own steady 60-degree heat at its core. Thorne's report back to Madison was stark. Coop A, Croft, 18 degrees, high fuel cost, 15% egg production. Coop B, Brant, 48 degrees, 0 fuel cost, 60% egg production. Brant's system was a masterwork of stacked, passive layers. Layer 1 was the Earth itself, the massive geothermal battery providing a baseline temperature of 45 to 50 degrees. Layer 2 was the 18-inch insulation envelope of straw and sawdust. This was the thermal break that isolated the pit from the frozen surface soil. It didn't create heat. It stopped heat loss. Air, trapped in the millions of tiny pockets within the straw, is one of the world's best insulators. Layer 3 was the deep litter. This was Brant's active furnace. The high-carbon straw mixed with high-nitrogen chicken manure, creating a perfect environment for thermophilic bacteria. As they broke down the waste, they released significant heat, warming the floor and the air directly above it. But Brant's true genius, the element that prevented the pit from becoming a toxic hole, was his air management system. He had engineered a passive geothermal ventilation system. Layer 4 was the air intake. Instead of a vent in the wall, Brant had buried a 4-inch clay pipe, 30 feet long, running 2 feet below the frost line. The pipe's inlet was a small stump, far from the coop. Air, even at 52 degrees, would enter this pipe and, over its 30-foot journey, be pre-warmed by the earth. By the time it entered the pit, the air was already 30-35 degrees. Layer 5 was the exhaust. At the high point of the roof, a 6-inch wooden chimney, insulated with more straw, extended 8 feet into the air. The hot, humid, ammonia-laden air from the birds and the compost would rise naturally, drawn out by a gentle stack effect, pulling fresh, pre-warmed air in through the underground pipe. It was a self-regulating, self-heating, breathing ecosystem. When the Great Blizzard of 1899 hit, the two systems met their ultimate test. At Silas Croft's farm, the modern co-op became a demonstration of catastrophic failure. The 50-mile-an-hour winds drove snow and 52 degrees air into every crack. The glass windows, which were supposed to trap solar heat, became the primary points of heat loss, registering 40 degrees on their inner surface. The stove, even if it could have been lit, would have been useless against such an overwhelming thermal deficit. The building was a failure. It was an amplifier for the cold. At Arthur Brant's farm, the blizzard was an asset. The 50 Bemburen winds passed harmlessly over the low-profile mound. The 3 feet of snow that fell on the sod roof didn't need to be shoveled. It was the final perfect layer of insulation, an R-40 blanket that Brant got for free. While Silas was huddled by his kitchen fire, writing off his flock, Arthur Brant put on his coat and checked his system. The intake pipe was clear. The exhaust chimney was puffing a gentle, steady plume of steam like a sleeping dragon. He descended the steps. The air was 42 degrees off. The compost was working. The birds were clustered, not in panic, but in comfort, drinking water that was still liquid. The system was performing exactly as he had calculated. The 52 degrees Celsius air was being passively warmed to 30 degrees Celsius by his earth tube, and the 42 degrees Celsius ambient temperature of the pit was more than his flock needed to survive. He had lost 0 birds. In the aftermath of the blizzard, the human impact was as profound as the environmental one. The thaw revealed the financial ruin of Silas Croft. He had lost 80% of his flock, wiping out his egg income for the year and putting his spring planting in jeopardy. He and his family were suddenly reliant on the community. That community now included Arthur Brant. Brant's flock, 100% intact, was back to 60% laying capacity within a week. Elsbeth, his wife, managed the operational side of the pit. She was the one who monitored the humidity, who knew by smell if the litter needed turning or if the ventilation was clear. She was the one who collected the eggs, and it was Elsbeth who brought a crate of 40 eggs to the Crofts' back door, not for sale, but as a gift. The gesture was more powerful than any technical argument. A week later, Silas Croft appeared at Brant's farm, not with the arrogance of a skeptic, but with the humility of a student. He brought Dr. Thorne with him. They didn't just look, they measured. They stayed for hours, mapping the airflow, taking temperature readings from the compost pile, and calculating the volume of the pit versus the number of birds. The chicken grave had become a subject of intense, pragmatic study. Dr. Thorne's subsequent report, A Geothermal and Biological Solution to Poultry Housing in Extreme Climates, was a quiet bombshell. It was published by the University of Wisconsin Agricultural Extension and reprinted in farm journals across the upper Midwest. The data was impossible to ignore. Thorne presented a side-by-side comparison that rocked conventional wisdom. The standard co-op, $45 cost, high fuel consumption, 80% flock loss in extreme cold. The Brant pit, $5 cost, for salvage, 0 fuel consumption, 0% flock loss. The report legitimized Brant's methods, replacing the narrative of an eccentric tinkerer with that of an innovator. The next summer, the sound of excavation was common in the county. Silas Croft, using Brant's plans, was the first to dig. He was not alone. 3 other farms followed suit. Local hardware merchants, who had previously stocked glass windows and stovepipes, found themselves with a run on 4-inch clay drainage tiles. The Brant pit was no longer an oddity. It was becoming the new standard. Driving through that same Wisconsin county a decade later, a traveler would have noticed a profound change in the agricultural landscape. The tall, stark white, modern chicken coops were gone, replaced by low, green, earth-bermed mounds that seemed a natural part of the rolling hills. The Wisconsin pit, as it came to be known, had been adopted, adapted, and improved upon, becoming a staple of cold climate farming from Minnesota to Maine. Arthur Brant's innovation was not, in the end, about the pit. It was about a shift in philosophy. He proved that survival in extreme environments was not a matter of resisting nature with brute force, but of understanding its systems. It wasn't about building thicker walls, but about designing smarter envelopes. It wasn't about generating more heat, but about losing less. Arthur Brant didn't fight the 52-degree winter. He simply harnessed the 45-degree earth, the 60-degree compost, and the 105-degree body heat of the chicken, and engineered a system where life could flourish, even when the world outside was frozen solid. He hadn't conquered the cold. He had simply designed a system that made it irrelevant.